Look, Greg, I think we know that monopolies, duopolies, anti-competitive behaviour does not serve the Australian consumer well. And so we can see that having a duopoly supermarket system of Coles and Woolworths is not in the best interest of Australians, and it means that our farmers are not getting the good deal that they ought to be getting, and Australian consumers are being penalised at the checkout. This is, I think, a long overdue reform that really needed to have come in much sooner than it has been now. You know, the anti-competitive behaviour, we can see that every time we go to the checkout and pay for groceries. So being able to hold these people accountable by making it a mandatory code of conduct, making sure that penalties match the practices that are taking place, and that these companies are incentivised to do better by farmers and consumers, I think is a really important step to take. So I really welcome what Craig Emerson has done here.
Just to follow up one point there with you, Sally, would it be a measurable price saving for consumers at the checkout by having this regime sitting over the top of those big operators? Would you bank on actual price reductions for customers? If so, by how much?
I think we know that greater competition is always better for consumers, and so this is one part of a broad sweep of changes that we're making around competition law. So the more players we can get into the supermarket space, I think the better for consumers, but also for farmers as well.
After stage 3 tax cuts, why is the government running out of puff on further tax reform, Sally Sitou?
Ken Henry is one of the greatest policy thinkers of our generation, so I have a lot of respect for him and the suggestions that he's making. And I think that one of the big points that he was making recently is about the intergenerational divide that is occurring in our country that is deeply troubling. And I absolutely see that happening now, you know, with housing affordability, how we're going to pay for aged care, HECS. All of these issues are really starting to hit that younger generation. And I think that there does need to be some reform in tax, but in other areas as well. But I do push back on the point that you make, Greg, that there isn't any tax reform that's happening at the moment. In the 2 years that we've been in government, we've already started to make some significant changes, and the tax cuts that you mentioned, those tax cuts were a difficult decision to make earlier this year, but the Prime Minister and Treasurer made those changes because we want all Australian taxpayers to benefit from these tax cuts. And the group that are going to benefit the most are Gen Z and millennials. 96% of them will be better off because of the changes that we are making. And that goes directly to what Ken Henry is making his point about the intergenerational divide.
Sure.
But we're also making those important tax reforms in other areas. So we've made changes with the petroleum resource rent tax so that Australians get a fairer deal with the resources that are being dug out of our ground. We've made changes to the EV taxes, and we've made changes to multinational tax to ensure that multinational companies are paying their fair share of tax.
Sally, but the structural changes, at least in the personal income tax scales, were actually sort of taken backwards against the original Morrison proposal, weren't they, in stage 3?
Well, I guess my point to Keith and to you, Greg, is that bracket creep doesn't just happen to those on the top income brackets. It's also happening for those on the lower income brackets. And the changes that we've made are directly going to benefit those people who are not earning as much, but they are slowly building up their income, and they are increasing into the next income bracket. So bracket creep is not something that just impacts our high income earners. It's felt down the entire chain of taxpayers, and these tax cuts are a more fair way of distributing and ensuring that they get a bigger slice of the tax cuts.
And Sally Sitou, I know you've got a bit of a frog in your throat, so we'll launch into a question with you on Rafah, the need for Israel, do you think, to heed the international advice of Prime Minister Albanese and others, and will they in all likelihood?
The Israeli Prime Minister cannot go down the path of bombing Rafah. We're now in the 7th month of this conflict, and there have been absolutely horrific bombings of Gaza and thousands of innocent Palestinians who have died in this conflict. I'm the co-chair of the Parliamentary Friends of UNICEF. It's the UN agency that is supporting children in Gaza. And I asked for a briefing to find out what was happening on the ground, and these are the horrific statistics that they gave to me. 70% of the thousands of Palestinian civilians who have been killed are children and women. 1,000 children have lost limbs in this conflict, and 1 in 6 of the children who are in the northern part of Gaza, where the most ferocious fighting is occurring, are malnourished. And I don't think, Greg, any of your viewers would think that that is right or justified. And so I think it's right that the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister have called for a humanitarian ceasefire as the first step towards a sustainable ceasefire. Because I think we all want the conflict in that region to end. There are no winners from this. The people who are paying the heaviest price are not Hamas, the terrorist organisation that instigated the attacks on 7th of October, but it is the innocent Palestinian children who are paying with their lives. Yeah. And I think that is the sad reality of what's happening there.